Ben Riggs presents Reading D&D Aloud. Episode 38, Becoming the Shadow, with Richard Dansky.
Greetings, everyone, to Reading D&D Aloud. I am apparently controversial historian Ben Riggs, and today we will not be reading D&D Aloud, but rather another tabletop role-playing game. With me is Richard Dansky. He is one of the top 20 video game writers in the world, according to Game Developer. He was a game developer at White Wolf during its golden age. He worked on Wraith, Changeling, Exalted, and Trinity. He worked on what may be the best White Wolf book of all time, in my opinion at least, Charnel Houses of Europe, the Shoah. He has, from since then, written 8 novels, 2 short story collections, and your current project was so interesting that I was like, let's not talk about that and let's hit record instead and tell me about it on the mic. So, Richard, tell me about your current writing project.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here. And I am currently working on a nonfiction book on being a video game writer called The Video Game Writer's Guide to Surviving an Industry That Hates You.
Wow. So why, speaking as a teacher who writes on the side and also podcasts a little bit, uh, video game writing always seems like the golden city on the hill where they bring a dump truck full of money out to your house and just pile it on your lawn. That's not the way it is.
You know, I've been looking for that dump truck for years and it hasn't shown. Occasionally I get small Amazon packages, but that's about it.
So
Um,
why does the industry hate you?
the title is a little bit tongue in cheek, but not entirely. Unfortunately, writing is something that has sort of come along late in the video game development process in a lot of ways. In the early days, a lot of times it was a task that was secondary and done at the end and relegated to the designer because it was words and the designer was the one in charge of words. And so the processes around writing have always grown up lagging the processes of other stuff. And as such, the challenges of being a video game writer are unique on many levels, and you're often fighting some institutional battles as well from people elsewhere on the team who maybe don't understand what you do or how you do it or what the value of it is or what you need to do it right.
Hmm.
And so there have been many books over the years written about game writing, about how to do that well, about how to write great dialogue, write game stories, build great characters, all absolutely needed, well written stuff. But there has been a bit of a void in writing about being a game writer and how you do the job moment to moment, day to day. And that goes far beyond just putting words down. Obviously, writing is the core of the job, but there is so much more that goes to it. If all you can do is write and you can't position yourself within the team, if you can't work with others on the team to collaborate to make sure that your stuff gets seen and their stuff gets seen and it's better together, if you can't convince people of the value of what you're doing, if you can't get sufficient time to do it well, if you can't build good feedback loops, all these things, then it doesn't matter. The best writer in the world can't function under adverse circumstances. So a lot of this book is about, hey, here's the day-to-day of the job that'll let you do the cool writing thing. And I felt that was needed.
Do you have a publisher yet?
Yes.
Who's going to publish it?
It's going through CRC, and it is due at the end of the month, so I am writing like a madman these days.
Is that your full-time gig right now?
No, I actually started a new job this week. I am the narrative director at Romero Games, and I am utterly thrilled to be doing that. John and Brenda Romero, obviously absolute legends in the field and wonderful people on top of that. And it is a pleasure and an honor to be working with them and their team.
I'm going to say video games are my like fourth or fifth nerddom. So
Hmm.
I'm gonna take a guess. Are those the Doom guys?
John has a long history in shooters.
But am I remembering wrong?
No,
No, he's not. Okay. So, and what are you working on there, or can't you say?
I cannot say.
You cannot say. Okay. I like that. I like mystery.
Mhm.
So, listeners, today we actually have, as fascinating as I find all that, um, we actually have Richard on today to talk about Wraith the Oblivion, and we're going to do a reading from Wraith the Oblivion 20th Anniversary Edition. But again, Richard, we really lean heavy into D&D on this podcast, even though like when I was in high school, it was all White Wolf all the time. Just, like and I was in high school in the 90s. So every year there was a new White Wolf game. It was a great time to be a nerd. The groups were 75% women. You could meet chicks. It was great. Loved it. An absolute dream. But for people who listen to this podcast and have only played D&D for the past 40 years, what is Wraith the Oblivion?
Wraith the Oblivion was the fourth game in the original World of Darkness series. World of Darkness was a gothic punk horror setting whereby you played supernatural creatures in the modern world, trying to deal with the realities of your existence. The most popular one being Vampire the Masquerade, Werewolf the Apocalypse, Mage the Ascension, Changeling the Dreaming, but dealing with all the hardship that came with being, in this case, a wraith, a ghost, a dead person, trying to handle the stuff that was left unfinished that had forced you to stick around post mortem, while also dealing with this incredibly ancient and convoluted afterlife where you had this massive empire of the dead with ghosts who'd been around for centuries, and beyond that, this cosmic horror of oblivion, the devouring void that seeks to end all existence. And it's a wonderfully rich world. You can do a whole lot of things in it, from street level adventuring and almost noir, honestly, to high fantasy and cosmic horror adventuring in what's called the Tempest. It's incredibly versatile. And it's also a very deep role playing game in a lot of ways. What it does, and all credit to the original designers of the game, I came on board after about, I guess, a year and a half, and
It was Mark Reinhagen, Sam Chupp, and I want to say I'm forgetting someone.
Jennifer Hartshorn.
Okay.
Jen did amazing work on that. She was the first Wraith developer.
Oh wow.
And the in any case, um, right, I've completely lost my train of thought. I'm sorry.
I can get you started again. Sorry, I
Okay.
interrupted you, but you were talking about the scope of the game and how you could do cosmic horror right down to personal stories. And I was going to say, that every time I played, it ended up being very personal and, for lack of a better way of putting it, psychologically harrowing. Um,
Harrowing is
because
a good word. Yes.
but
It's mechanic.
if that strikes something, I would say go from that, or else I can keep
Oh,
talking.
absolutely. Yeah. One of the things that Wraith did brilliantly from the get go, again, credit to the original designers, is that it married character motivation to mechanics. You have these things called passions and fetters. They're the things that drive your wraithly existence and also tie you to the world of living that you have to protect, that you get power from by acting in accordance with. And so these are role playing hooks that also are system hooks. And on top of that, you have what's called the shadow, which is the dark half of the Wraith character, often played by another player in the group, who is there to try and get that character to fail. And it's not just rah, 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 I'm going to kill you. It's much more complicated and interesting than that, and it requires a lot of trust in between players, and sometimes some subtlety and sometimes some give and take. But it makes for an incredibly rich and incredibly rewarding role playing experience.
Yeah, again, when I played it, it was always somebody else at the table who was your shadow, and was trying to make you fail, and they had a character sheet, as I recall, correct?
Yes.
So they could actually do things to you. It wasn't just some, kind of fluff. And it when I was playing a shadow, I certainly felt like it gave me license to be a real jerk in a way that was probably not licit in most of the rest of polite society. And because I was playing with friends that I'd known for years, I knew just where to stick the knife. Which is one of, and I got as good as I gave, that's for sure. A friend's girlfriend was cast as my shadow. She was very good looking, and now that she's a little bit older, she's actually won a few like mom beauty pageants. But to be a teenager and just have this really pretty girl telling me these terrible things may have been a damaging but psychologically formative experience for me. Um, so we're going to read a section entitled Drawing Lines in the Mind from Wraith 20th on the Shadow, correct?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to start us off reading. Don't be afraid to interrupt me, and I might ask you some questions as we go too. Let me just uh, make sure I can see you while I'm reading. Okay, okay. I cannot minimize while I'm recording, so if you want to speak up, but because I won't be able to see you while I'm reading, okay?
No worries. I promise not to make faces.
All right. Oh, and I should ask, did you write this or did somebody else?
That's an excellent question. And frankly, the exact authorship of a lot of Wraith 20 has vanished into the mist of time.
Huh.
I wrote an awful lot of that book for various reasons. I think I wrote this part. I won't swear to it. All I will say is that the team on the book, particularly folks like Charlie Bates, just did an amazing job, and it was a pleasure to, at the same time, bring back a lot of the classic Wraith writers who had done such great work in the old days, and also leaven the mix with new writers who loved the game and brought something new to it.
All right. Drawing Lines in the Mind by an Unknown Genius. A shadow is not simply a wraith's evil twin. Shadows have, as previously noted, distinct personalities and voices, and are undoubtedly self-aware. Some go so far as to name themselves, doing so to underscore their differences from the wraiths whose subconscious generated them. But at the same time, they are not distinct and separate. No matter how much a shadow denies it, they are a part of that wraith. And so, the shadow has to judge the degradation it wishes to inflict on the wraith against its own tolerance for pain. On a certain level, the shadow isn't actively suicidal. It just wants to see the psyche lose. Is the psyche the part being played by the nominal wraith player at the table?
Yes.
All right. The it just wants to see the psyche lose at everything forever. Nothing a shadow gives or offers, whether it's advice or power, comes without a price. Wraiths can only do what they did in life when that wicked little voice comes calling, and struggle not to give in. No matter the promises or apologies a wraith gives after their shadow lures them into havoc, odds are the damage of giving in will last for eternity. If a wraith accepts a single offer from his shadow, that opens the door to the next, and the next, with the shadow's vice-like grip ultimately squeezing out every hope and good intention. The shadow knows this, and as a result can afford to pick its battles. A shadow who is constantly blathering in its psyche's ear is ultimately easier to tune out as white noise. A shadow who waits for a desperate moment and then offers something that seems to come with no strings attached is far more difficult to resist. Beyond its role as tempter, tormentor, and downfall, a shadow also orchestrates harrowings. What are harrowings again?
At certain times, if a wraith is damaged beyond a certain level, um, they fall into what is called a harrowing. A harrowing is a self-contained psychodrama where that character is tested. They go out of the room for a minute. The rest of the players, led by the shadow guide, come up with the scenario, the escape condition, and it is a self-contained moment of pure role play where the wraith who is being harrowed has to figure their way out by going into their own darkest heart. And it
Wow.
can be absolutely intense and absolutely amazing. There are no boundaries except for obviously the ones of courtesy and friendship at the table. So it's just imagination run amok. A lot of times it goes off of a fetter, something that is tying the wraith to the real world, or a passion, something that drives the wraith. There's actually a picture in Wraith Second Edition of a bunch of ghostly superheroes slugging it out. And that comes from a line in the text of Second Edition that talks about a harrowing about someone's prized comic book collection. And the
Wow.
art came in, and the artist who did that was a fabulous artist. And he always attached the piece of text that he was illustrating to the back of his pictures. And this one, it just wrote, "Ask Dansky."
That's amazing. A shadow also orchestrates harrowings. These desperate personal nightmares are crucibles for the soul, dragging a wounded wraith down into the labyrinth itself to face his worst fears made manifest. There are only a few ways these nightmare shadow plays end. The ultimate destruction of the wraith, the devastation and loss of one of his passions or fetters, or, if the wraith demonstrates sufficient courage and ingenuity, escape. But even those who emerge from a harrowing, theoretically unscathed, bear the scars of what they have gone through and what they hope never to face again. Faced with all this, the struggle against the shadow may seem impossible. And a partner is someone who controls shadows, as I recall.
A wraith is a partner is a wraith whose specialty is dealing with the dark emotional energy that powers shadows.
Ooh. Only vigilance, will, and the occasional visit to a partner to sap the shadow's supply of angst can allow a wraith to hold the line. But when a shadow grows powerful, it is not restricted to speaking only to the psyche that hosts it. It can reach out to the wraiths around it, even work with other shadows and seduce the companions a wraith loves most. If the shadow grows powerful enough, watchful vigilance may be the only thing to stand between a wraith and oblivion. Let me ask here, and again, if you don't know the answer to this, that's fine. To what degree did the design of this come from the lore, from the world that was being built? And to what degree did this come from we want to have this Jekyll and Hyde dynamic at the table. We want to make sure that we're empowering the Mr. Hyde personality of the table. So they worked backwards from that when they say things like it's not simply an evil twin. They have distinct personalities. They're unaware, they're self-aware. They give themselves names. Do you know which came first there, the chicken or the egg?
My understanding, and again, this was before I joined White Wolf in the summer of 1995, is that it was Sam Chupp's focus in the design stuff. He loved the idea of the Jungian shadow and sought to incorporate that, and that was the genesis of all of this.
Wow. So it went from philosophy into game design to my table.
There's a lot of deep currents in Wraith, and they were there when I got there, and I may have added a few deep waters myself during my time at the helm.
And any deep waters that you're particularly proud of?
There was one moment when I was accused online, and I have no idea why, of making Wraith an explicitly Christian game. Now, this is funny on multiple levels because I'm not Christian, and also because the model for the underworld that I had been working from was directly out of Hesiod's Theogony, which says that Tartarus was, I think, 3 times as deep as Olympus is tall. And so it was informed by a lot of classical knowledge. It was informed by a lot of cosmic horror. It was informed by a lot of classic ghost stories. The one thing that really was not there was modern religious intent. So that that particular rant struck me as funny back in the day.
All right, then let me get back to reading here. All right. I moved up a little bit. There we go. Shadow play. Role-playing the shadow is simultaneously a tremendous responsibility and incredibly liberating. On one hand, having the opportunity to be the bad guy while in character, spitting an endless stream of insults and snarky observations, can be a lot of fun. On the other hand, making sure never to abuse the knowledge another player entrusted you with can be a thin line to walk. At its core, shadow guiding is about providing a counterpart to another player's character. And shadow guiding means you're running the shadow, right?
Yes.
Okay. It's about offering alternatives, not good alternatives, but alternatives, and giving voice to all the doubts and fears and frustrations that a wraith can have. It's not about competition or trying to take down another player's character. It is about giving them more and better material to roleplay with by enabling them to riff off an enemy who knows them best, themselves. In practical terms, shadow guiding is a means of enriching the gameplay of your Wraith Chronicle, adding a layer of adversarial intrigue and texture to the Chronicle. That means, at the very least, talking to the psyche on a semi-regular basis. What is said is entirely up to the shadow guide. It can be threats, promises, offers, or even just running commentary. And yes, shadow guiding is a great way to get your otherwise disruptive snark out productively. What matters is that the psyche isn't allowed to go about its business securely. There's always a reminder that someone else is watching, listening, judging, and most importantly, opposing. Comments from a shadow guide to a psyche can be spoken out loud for the entire group to hear, or they can be communicated via a note or text privately. Unless circumstances specifically dictate it, the other wraiths in the circle do not hear the shadow's voice. They do, however, hear any response the psyche makes to the shadow's commentary, which can make things very clear when a wraith is having focus issues. And I just want to point out, again, that dynamic at the table is so interesting. Knowing that if you want to shut the shadow up, you're going to have to talk. And if you're talking, everyone else can hear you, but they're not going to know what the shadow is saying. Just provides so many interesting role-playing game opportunities, in my opinion.
That was always my feeling as well. The shadow was one of the things I loved most about Wraith. It was one of the things that was most appealing to me in terms of accepting the offer to take over the game line. And that was something that I really wanted to explore. That's why I proposed and developed the book, The Shadow Player's Guide, to really just get more into the meat of it. And it's something that really spoke to me as something really unique and interesting in a role-playing experience.
The Shadow Guide can also use the various powers at the Shadow's disposal to influence events. Offers of shadow dice should always be made directly to the psyche, with the negotiation between the two playing out as long as necessary. And shadow dice are like bonus dice, right?
Yes, but with a catch.
With a catch. Did you ever come up with any memorable catches?
Well, if you botched a shadow dice roll, bad things happened.
All right. Thorns, on the other hand, should be activated through direct communication with the storyteller. And what are thorns again?
Thorns are powers that are unique to the shadow.
Ooh. Whether the shadow then wants to take credit for whatever chaos follows is entirely up to the shadow guide. Keeping the source of a sudden specter attack unknown can help keep a wraith off balance. On the other hand, gloating to the psyche over what's just happened while knowing the psyche can't tell anyone else has its benefits as well. The third thing the Shadow Guide does is guide harrowings. As the adversary who knows the wraith best, the Shadow Guide sets up, in conjunction with the storyteller and other players as necessary, The parameters, scenario, and conditions of every harrowing the Wraith falls into. This doesn't mean coming to each and every session with a massive flowchart of potential harrowing scenarios, but it does mean that a shadow guide should be ready to take point on a harrowing should that unfortunate situation arise. Finally, the shadow guide can, at appropriate intervals, initiate a takeover of the Wraith's corpus through a process called catharsis. This should be a rare and momentous occasion, as it can have all sorts of implications for both character and chronicle. And this is describing a straight up possession by the shadow, right?
Yes.
Great. Even when a shadow guide has the capability to initiate catharsis, that doesn't mean it should be done immediately or automatically. A shadow guide should treat the option to mount a short-term coup as a rare and golden opportunity, and not something to be gobbled up as soon as humanly possible. For more on catharsis, see page XX.
I
All right.
apologize, but I had to get the page XX in there just as a tip of the cap to the old days.
Well, unless you feel like you already answered this, what is it about this passage that really speaks to you?
It really calls out the unique and powerful aspects of shadow guiding, something that is so important to Wraith that you really don't see in other games, that you certainly hadn't seen in other games to that point. And I freely confess, I'm not as up on the TTRPG scene as I should be these days, simply because my focus is elsewhere. But I have not heard of too much that plows those same fields and goes for those same experiences. It was something unique and magical that, again, the original designers, all credit to them, came up with, and that I picked up and ran with. My sort of big innovation to the Shadow stuff was in second edition, I gave the Shadow experience points, because it felt like to that point the Wraith would get more and more powerful and the Shadow stayed the same, and I wanted the Shadow to become increasingly powerful as well, to make sure the dynamic remained interesting and not lopsided.
You know, I would say White Wolf was such a unique black flower. Like it seemed to spring into existence, and in many ways it served a community that was not being served by tabletop role-playing games at the time. And, obviously Onyx Path is out there putting things out, and obviously I think Renegade has Vampire and Werewolf now, and they're still putting things out. But think it's very different to be in the mode of we are publishing this thing that is already complete in some way and we're trying to keep it alive, as opposed to what you're doing in the 90s at White Wolf, which is we're creating this entirely new thing, uh creating an entirely new mythology that will go on. And again, I don't know, you probably didn't know it was going to go on for decades, maybe you did, I don't know. But um
We really weren't thinking decades ahead at that point. We were. I will say this: the White Wolf Studios were an incredible bubbling cauldron of unfettered creativity. We had very, very long leashes to do what we thought was proper for the game lines and cool and interesting, and explore stuff that we thought that the fans would get into. And so we went some amazing places that other games might have not explored, because they were really out there. And all credit to the folks who let us do that, and to my fellow developers, Ian Lemke, Phil Brucato, Ethan Skemp, Jess Heinig, Jen Hartshorn, all these folks who did amazing stuff and who picked up that baton and ran with it and created a world organically that people identified with and felt that they belonged to. And one of the things that struck me many years later, I was talking with a friend who had been a big White Wolf player back in the day, about how we really thought back in the day what we were doing was important, that we were making games that mattered. And she said it absolutely was. those games gave a place to people who maybe didn't have another place. It gave them a safe space to experiment with things socially, with questions of identity, with figuring out who they were. Often when there wasn't a real world space where they could do that. That was the message that I got, and I humbly accepted the rebuke, as it were, and I am grateful that we were able to do that for people.
And
Um,
again,
it, it, it's I think yeah, I guess it did matter. It really did matter, and that I think is part of why it has endured.
well, I will confess to my audience that like this is emotional for me in a way that talking about Dungeons and Dragons is not. In some ways, I think that the fact that I do not have a strong emotional attachment to Dungeons and Dragons, and yet I spend a lot of time on Dungeons and Dragons, is one of my features. Um, but White Wolf is very emotional for me. It's, the thing that I was super into when I was 17, which is just that peak age where you're going to be like, well, everything should be the way it was when I was 17 forever. So take that grain of salt when I say I don't think that there is a successor to White Wolf today in the gaming industry. There are successor games, there are reprints and attempts, and uh, I purchased a lot of those. I've played a lot of those. Are you familiar with Urban Shadows?
I am not.
Long story short, it's a kind of attempt to get the White Wolf feel using the Powered by the Apocalypse engine. And again, I really like it. I really enjoy the game. Um, but even then, it's an attempt to get at what White Wolf was doing with modern mechanics. And again, they do a good job of it. Uh, but still, we have a lot of people kind of trying to be the black flower that White Wolf was. I just don't see it out there anymore. Um, and
We were very much a creation of our time and place, of the experience that we had brought to the table growing up on Dungeons and Dragons and Call of Cthulhu and those early role playing games, and wanting to take that experience and bring it in a new direction, and the cultural stuff that informed a lot of that as well. And so we were we were very much a product of that time and that place and that the culture that we were all soaking in. And for that moment, we made magic. And what I like to think is that what we did paved the way for other people to make their own magic going forward. That our stuff was of its time and place, that other people could play it and get inspired themselves and do other things. And I'm not going to say there's a direct line from what we did to any particular game that's out now, but because I don't know anyone's particular personal inspiration, but I like to think that what we did in terms of maybe kicking open the doors a little and go focusing on social mechanics and things like that broaden the idea of role playing games in a way that other people would then pick up and run and do amazing things with.
So let me ask you a pesky question, because again, this is a pretty D&D centric audience that's going to be hearing this. If there's somebody listening who's like, "Well, this all sounds very intriguing. I've never picked up a White Wolf game or considered picking up a White Wolf game. If there was a gamer coming along in 2025 that you wanted to kind of show the White Wolf ethos to, what would you recommend they pick up?"
I would recommend that they stay far, far away from the television show Kinder the Embraced, but that's another story. No, more seriously, Vampire is really the keystone of it all. Vampire established the fantasy, Vampire established the world, Vampire created that tension between I am playing the monster and I want to be the hero, but at the same time I have to do these terrible things. And it's very much, I think, the entry point. As wonderful as the other games are, and I have love for all of them, the the starting point is always Vampire.
Do you have a preferred edition?
You know what? Every edition is different. Every edition is modern. The things that we worked on back in the second edition and Vampire Revised days, it's a very, very different world now, and that stuff in some ways just absolutely does not hold up. So get the latest edition of Vampire. It speaks to what the world is now, and I have nothing but appreciation for the fact that people have picked up that banner over the years and carried it forward and reinvented it in a way that shows the enduring value of what was there at the start.
How did you end up working at White Wolf?
I knew Jen Hartshorn at Wesleyan, and she went down. She was the first Wraith developer, and she knew that I wanted to write, and she knew that I ran games. We ran LARPs together, and I ran a 23-person Villains and Vigilantes game through 4 years of college. And so when she became developer and she needed writers, she reached out to me and made the very generous offer to write a couple chapters of the book Haunts, which was a setting book for Wraith First Edition. And she said, I want something Lovecraftian and then go crazy. So I did one chapter that was Lovecraftian called The Tillinghast Mansion, because my specialty in those days was H.P. Lovecraft, and I had actually done a thesis on him. And the other
I'm going to shout out briefly to the audience. If you don't know, Tillinghast is a character from I forget which short story, but
yes. So I stole the name. I freely admit it. But then I did, because I grew up in Philadelphia and going down the shore in Jersey was the thing. I did a casino set in Atlantic City, and that was my second one. And I remember I was nervous as heck trying to get started. And at the same time, I was in graduate school. And as a side hustle, I was teaching for the Princeton Review, doing test prep. And so one night I found myself proctoring a fake SAT in the basement of a church in suburban Boston in the middle of summer with no air conditioning, sitting at a desk that had been designed for an 8-year-old while the students filled in their forms. And it just came to me like, oh, this is what I have to do. And I started writing. And that was where it all began, really. And from there, I got to work on the Wraith Player's Guide, did the opening fiction for that, and came up with a couple of No Arcanoi and some other stuff. And then when Jen shifted over to Vampire after Andrew Greenberg left, I was lucky enough to get the opportunity to take over Wraith and at the same time Mind's Eye Theater, the live-action role-playing line. So I moved down to Atlanta and took over, and that was August of 1995.
So what were the White Wolf offices like in August of 1995?
Dark.
Spiritually or literally?
Literally, the lighting was terrible. No, it was a converted warehouse in suburban Atlanta, and some of us had offices and some of us had cubes. When I started, I had an office, and it was a pretty wild place. People did what they felt like doing, and at one point, I remember I would have candles on my desk because I like writing to candlelight. At one point, I was over talking to someone on the other side of the building, and there was a voice on the PA, Rich Dansky, come back to your office. Your desk is on fire. So the question was, why get on the PA instead of putting out the fire? But we will leave that for another time. But again, it was a crazy place. People were just incredibly creative and unfettered, and it was that was the first office. The second office was a little smaller. It was in the same office complex with just a different space, and but out back we would play street hockey. I understand there was shopping cart jousting at some points. It was a good time with really amazing and sharp and talented and wonderful people. And I was very privileged to be a part of that. And I am happy that I was able to contribute to it. I am still in touch with a lot of those folks to this day, a quarter century later.
Wow. And this is a strange question, perhaps, but would they tell you how your book sold?
Yep.
Like, did they give you royalties or just let you know?
There was some complication back then, but the dirty secret is that nobody was doing that for the money.
I mean, I'm sure that's true.
Yeah, no, there was not a lot of money to go around, but we were pretty well aware of the sales numbers by and large. In that that helped us plan what sort of books we were proposing to put out there, And okay, sales are dipping a little bit on this one, so let me do a book that's going to be a little less experimental, a little more exciting to a broader range of players. Hey, let me do a crossover book like The Risen that'll get vampire players involved. And so there was a little bit of that informing the choices we made, but at the same time, very much about the creativity and trying to do right by the world that we were all swimming in.
Do you recall what the Wraith core books numbers were like at all, or no?
That was a long time ago.
Just figured I'd ask.
Obviously, vampires up here and werewolf and mage were here, and wraith not so much. I mean, it did well for the industry. It just wasn't at the same plateau as maybe some of the other games were.
It's a harder sell, right? It's a game about death.
Yeah.
Yeah,
My
but
feeling was this: the other games ask you to take one step away from your reality. It's our world, but you're a vampire. It's our world, but you're a werewolf. Wraith is, it's our world, but you're dead, and there's these other dead people, and by the way, there's a voice in your head, and that was a lot to ask people to do, and so the fantasy was a little less accessible, I think, and also just the level of trust that shadow guiding demanded from a group made it a tricky sell sometimes.
you can imagine that being a real difficult uh experience at a convention when you get a bunch six strangers together and suddenly, you have to be the dark side of someone else that you never met before. You could see that going really right or really wrong. Um,
That is why I wrote very detailed character bios for convention games that I ran. but but speaking seriously, when it gelled, it was magic. And I will say the playtest group I had at the office, which was Josh Gorfey and Charlie Bates, Cynthia Summers, Michael Rollins, just wonderful, wonderful team. They played off each other perfectly. They knew when to pull back and when to go forward. They they got instinctive with one another with the shadow play, and it was fantastic. Particularly since Charlie was playing a disguised specter, so that was a lot of fun. But there was one time when we were doing a playtest session at the office, the old office, in the big library, and I would do things like maybe light a couple candles and play some spooky music, set the tone. And one of our layout artists, a guy named Shaggy Dixon, was working late that night, and he wanted and said, "Hey, can I just sit in and watch for a while?" And we said, "Sure." So he sat there for a while, and I think we actually did a harrowing that night. And he got up and said, "This is too freaky for me, man, and you're weirding me out." And he walked out, and we sort of took that as a victory.
well, a thing I will often say is that role-playing games allow us to tell stories that help us make meaning of our life. And, for D&D, sometimes that's pretty implicit. And you kind of have to look around the corners to see where the meaning might be. But with Wraith, it's right there on the table. You're
Mm-hmm.
eating the meat of meaning every time you sit down, which I'd imagine is remarkable when it goes well, but when it can be, I can see it was a bit much for me when this woman is like, well, this girl at the time is yelling at me and being my wraith, being my shadow. So, Richard, if people find you fascinating, what work of yours would you recommend they go pick up?
I'm doing a lot of fiction writing these days, and that's something that I find a lot of joy in. And so I would recommend one of two books. If they want a novel, Firefly Rain is a Southern Gothic ghost story that I did that got a starred review from Publishers Weekly and some lovely blurbs from some really smart people. And that one is something that people really find resonates.
Can you say that
Most
title one
recently,
more
I did
time?
Firefly Rain.
Firefly Rain.
Alternately, my most recent book was a short story collection called A Meeting in the Devil's House. And that's a little broader in scope, and it's got everything from stories of zombie frogs to man-eating Sasquatches and top hats to a drunk unicorn at a fancy dress party, werewolf family Thanksgiving, a magical pirate rabbi who fights zombies, a southern fried ghost hunter at the Devil's Tramping Ground where he does indeed meet the devil. So that I cast my net a bit wider. I was a little more, shall we say, confident in tackling other subject matters as I grew into my fiction writing. And so I'm really proud of that one, and people seem to really like it.
That's hilarious. Well, I will definitely put a link to Firefly Rain in the show notes. Um, I cannot. I am interested to know what the listeners think because, like I said, for me, this is a much more personal and emotional episode than perhaps they're used to. But again, the White Wolf games are just it practically is my adolescence, and we all know how much we all value our adolescences. Um, but we're kind of winding down here, so I'll say, Richard, I thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it. Hopefully, we drive some sales of Firefly Rain, and I appreciate you coming on. Thanks so much. If you ever need anything from me, let me know. And again, if you ever need to boost a game or your book, let me know, and we'll have you back on.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much for having me. I hope what I said is interesting to your audience, and
It was very
it,
interesting to me, so I liked it. So they seem to
yeah.
like what I like, so hopefully it works. So thank
And,
you so
and
much,
I will
Richard.
say, I was a D&D blue boxer from the days way back. My first D&D edition was before there were dice, when you had to cut the little plastic chits out of the laminated sheet and use those. So D&D, near and dear to my heart.
You're a
I'm just
grognard of
glad,
long
but it
standing.
launched me into World of Darkness, and I'm forever grateful for that.
And you went to BC?
I did my undergraduate at Wesleyan and then my graduate work at Boston College.
I was down the road at BU.
Okay. There was a used record store right in front of one of the buildings at BU. It was in the basement of one of the, I think, the dorm buildings, and I can't remember the name for the life of me, but I spent way too much money there when I was at Boston College.
When did you graduate Boston College?
I was there in 92 to 94.
92, yeah, so, yeah, I got there 5 years later. So, anyway, you have a good night, Richard. It was so good to talk to you. Thanks so much, and be well, okay?
You too. Take care.